Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Turok, the Dinosaur Hunter. Is there any cooler of a title? And is there any more of an epic concept? A Native American warrior who hunts dinosaurs. That concept has actually consistently been popular since 1956. Now on this channel, I have reviewed the first two Turok games and the Turok 2008 remake. But until today, I've not reviewed the third original game. But before we get into that game, let's first take a look at Turok's history.
Turok, Son of Stone was a comic that debuted in 1956 and featured Turok and his brother Andar finding the Lost Valley. In this Lost Valley, there are numerous ancient beasts that they must do battle with to survive. While there, they find other humans and have to cross language and cultural barriers. The characters of Turok and Andar are much like we would expect from Batman and Robin. Turok is tough and knowledgeable, and Andar is the plucky sidekick, always getting into trouble. For the 1950s, the comic is surprisingly well written and has more than stood the test of time. This is an adventure book, and each story legitimately feels like an adventure. The writers and artists put their heart and soul into the book and are really efficient with their plotting, and each comic usually accomplishes something. The dialogue could be better, as there is a lot of exposition and it feels really stilted, but that was a 1950s thing. One more thing to point out is that the publisher, Dell Comics, mentions that they don't have to follow the comics code because they're not putting in any objectionable material. So you would think that the comic could be a lame sauce repeater and be a really idiotic and immature mess that would appeal to no age groups. The reality is, the comic is surprisingly mature and also surprisingly goes places that other comics of the time never went. And it gets really hardcore at times. In one issue, Turok and Andar poison some arrows and then pincushion a T-Rex. What's also quite epic is that the bow gets some screen time and it's treated like a wonder weapon by the other humans in the Lost Valley, and Turok actually shows the other humans how to make them. The comic really does treat Turok and Andar as more or less proto-samurai jacks. They are peaceful and will listen to reason and will use their greater knowledge and tech to help their fellow man. Overall, solid comic, well worth hunting down.
And then, the 90s comic blew the original out of the proverbial water.
Turok, Dinosaur Hunter was published by Valiant Comics in 1992. Turok and Andar are revamped to be more hardcore. In the original comic, they were pre-Columbian Indians, and in this comic, they are now 19th century Native Americans, and are no longer brothers. Turok now is a stoic man of stone, but Andar teaches him to laugh and be a little more open. He is less of a Robin and more of a Nightwing this time around. Early issues for Turok Dinosaur Hunter are a little weird. Turok issue 0 is basically a huge setup for the Valiant universe as a whole, and introduces the Lost Land instead of the Lost Valley, and also introduces a crap ton of characters and factions, and then by the end invalidates all of them, so try to keep up. Turok and Andar end up in the Lost Land where they meet other Valiant characters, and then a new villain shows up named Mother God. But she first appears to be good, and tricks Turok into working for her, and Turok goes down the dark path. But then some other Valiant heroes will wake him up to the fact that Mother God is evil, and Turok rebels and Mother God is defeated. But then this erases the Lost Land, and Turok is spat out into the greatest decade ever, the 1980s. The first real solo Turok Dinosaur Hunter adventure begins at the very end of issue 1. Turok is spat out into the jungles of Colombia, and he is facing the might of the Monarch! And also Dr. and Mrs. the Monarch. No joke, Monarch actually has a mate. And like in the Venture Brothers, Monarch is pretty crap at henching old Turok, and Turok kicks the crap out of him in just a few issues' time. Also, I love 90s artwork. Turok looks like he's 8 feet tall, with muscles that would make the young guns look upon him with envy. The comic will later introduce the character of Joshua Fireseed, and Turok will have to take him under his wing. The plot then focuses on fighting the villain or Dino of the Week, and it's some pretty good stuff all around. And thank Ysmir, the comic is good with its weapons too. Turok starts the comic with his Mother God forged tech bow, and later gets an FNFAL, an AR-10, and of course, a 1911. In both the 50s comic and this one, Turok is the actual name of the character. Hell, it's on his bloody social security card, for crying out loud. After the Valiant run, you would get the Acclaim comics. The Acclaim comics take place in a different continuity entirely. Now, Turok is no longer a guy, but rather a title, and the Light Burden would be introduced. The Light Burden is essentially a magical bag that has a portal to a pocket dimension, wherein Turok stores all of his various weapons. The games draw their continuity primarily from the Acclaim comics, but in Turok 1 you will see a few bits of inspiration from the Valiant comics. Mainly, the Turok character in that game is based around Turok as seen in the Valiant comics, and the boss, the Long Hunter, is a reference to a character seen in the Valiant comics as well. As for the Acclaim comics, I alas do not have enough time to go into depth on them, but I will talk about them further in later reviews. Now we're going to move on and take a look at the Turok games on the Nintendo 64. The very first Turok game would be released in the year 1996. It would be developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim. This would be one of the cornerstones of the Nintendo 64 library and push that system to its limits. The graphics for the time were simply amazing, the levels were large and sprawling, and the weapons were transcendent. The distance fog is real, though, and the game gets flack for it, but seriously, the PS1 wishes it could get games this awesome. The game even pushed the controller itself to the limit, and actually used a controller configuration that was more or less a progenitor to the dual analog controls currently seen in console FPSs today. This was the first Turok game that I ever played, but not the first that I ever owned. Rather, I rented both it and the console to see if I wanted to take the plunge on the N64. As you would imagine, the following year I received a Nintendo 64 for Christmas, and my first game for that system was Turok 2: The Seeds of Evil. This game was a true sequel. It fixed the distance fog issue, added in even more weapons, and made the levels larger and filled with more enemies. The story was improved as well, and you actually had greater context for the dinosaurs you were hunting, and is still to this day my favorite Turok game. Turok Rage Wars would be released in 1999, and was a multiplayer-only game. I never played it, although I remember the commercial and felt disappointed that it was not a true sequel. Alas, by the year 2000, I had kind of forgotten about the Turok series, and thus I didn't play Turok 3, an oversight that gives me a superlative game to play today.
Let's get into the goddamn game already!
Turok 3: Shadow of Oblivion was developed and published by Acclaim Entertainment and released in the year 2000. It serves as a direct sequel to Turok 2 and is a major iteration on the series. The gameplay is substantially changed from the first two games. In Turok 1 and 2 you had massive open-ended levels to explore, whereas here you have much more linear but detailed levels. This is a good example of streamlining. Streamlining wasn't always a bad thing. Some early games had a lot of piddly crap, and when they finally started paring it back, games started to get a little more fun and a little less tedious. Turok 1 and 2, while the levels in those games were actually pretty damn good, and still pretty good even to this day, they had the issue of piddly crap. You had to find a certain number of keys to progress, and finding all those keys is not an easy prospect. As a kid, I about never found those bloody keys, and as an adult, I had just about as much trouble. Those keys are hidden fairly well, and if you miss just one, you gotta backtrack through the entire level. Turok 3 jettisons that entirely. Each level is fairly easy to navigate, and you don't even really need a map, because the game is constantly pushing you towards the exit. This means the levels are much more linear and are a little less enjoyable than Turok 1 and 2's, but they're also a little less annoying compared to Turok 1 and 2's. And this is where it comes down to personal preference. Even though I can complain endlessly about those bloody keys in Turok 1 and 2, I actually prefer the key hunts because while the levels in those games aren't quite as graphically impressive as Turok 3's, they were much more satisfying because you were constantly pitting yourself against the level designers to actually progress. With that in mind, though, Turok 3 makes for a much more cinematic experience. Which one is better is certainly up to the player. The shooting is still pretty damn fun. However, one of the more disappointing aspects of Turok 3 is the fact that the weapons really aren't that amazing, and there are none that really stand out like the weapons seen in Turok 2. The fan-favorite Cerebral Bore makes a return and even gets an upgrade where you can remote detonate it, But really, all these weapons are just weapons we've seen before, and they're even called by the same names as well. But there are a few returns from Turok 1 this time. The carbine returns from the first game, and it's by far the most effective weapon in the game, as its 3-round burst can kill most enemies from a reasonable distance. Sadly, the shotgun has been nerfed, and it has pitifully weak range, and sadly is far less useful than it was in previous games.
In the 9 years since my last Turok review, numerous gun manufacturers have set out to prove me wrong, and they've manufactured a wide variety of double-barrel pump-action shotguns. But while the DP-12 might look cool on the screen, give me a 870 any day.
Another complaint is the fact that the Razorwind has some pretty bad hit detection. The Razorwind in Turok 2 was pretty much a guaranteed one-hit kill, whereas in this game, when you throw it at an enemy, it's kind of a dice roll as to whether or not it actually hits anything. Sadly, the weapons could do with some major improvements. They are by far the most disappointing weapons in the entire Turok trilogy. Unlike in the first 2 games, you have 2 characters to choose from, Daniel and Joseph Fireseed. They are siblings to the mighty Joshua Fireseed. They each have their own abilities. Danielle has a grappling hook that allows her to reach higher places, and it's really bloody cool and really bloody impressive on the Nintendo 64. John Redcorn's bastard son, Joseph, has the less cool ability of crawling into small areas.
Now you can unlock Joshua Fireseed so long as you don't die or cheat.
This game is so crushingly hard, and that is mainly due to a complete and total lack of health packs, and enemies that are numerous and do a short ton of damage. The worst enemies are the flesh eaters at the end of the game. These bastards have a grenade that I swear does 50 points of damage, and they have a fucking cleaver that block your goddamn shots. The bosses for the game are actually less tough than the enemies, but they are often puzzle bosses and you cannot just shoot them till they die. This is actually pretty bloody excellent, as it makes defeating the bosses that much more satisfying. Although, sometimes you will need to look up a walkthrough to figure out what the hell you need to bloody well do. All told, the difficulty feels more annoying than fun at times. The hard enemies I can handle, but there really needs to be way more health packs than there are. And you get whole crate loads of ammo, but hardly any bloody bandage boxes. Had I played this as a kid, I would have cheated so fast. Hell, it's what I did with the first 2 games. Here, you don't necessarily need to cheat, but you're gonna wear out your F2 key nonetheless. Throughout the video, I will be playing as the cooler Turok sibling, Danielle. The grappling hook really makes the levels that much more fun to reverse, and shows that Acclaim really put those 24-hour shifts to good use. The controls with the game are pretty bloody good, and map to an Xbox 360 gamepad quite well. The only minor quibble is the fact that you have to scroll to your special ability instead of it just being a button. Graphically, the game looks really good for the N64. The textures are much more complex than we got in Turok 1, and they really improve on what we saw in Turok 2. The 3D models look less like masses of polygons and now resemble real things. The distance fog has been toned way down, and now looks almost modern in some places. The weapons are a little more detailed, but the carbine could look a little bit better since that heat shield just screams Gecko 45. Alas, even the soundtrack isn't very good. In fact, it just seems like it's the same repetitive tracks over and over again. What's actually kind of funny is the track that you pretty much hear throughout the entire game is actually a track from Turok Rage Wars, and taken as a whole, the Turok 3 soundtrack is by far the weakest in the original Turok trilogy. The sounds for the weapons are pretty good, and the shotgun sounds like it should, even if it isn't all that useful. The voice acting is pure 90s cheese, but I love it all the same. The footage you are seeing here was recorded from RetroArch, and I was using the Mupen 64 core. This game will work with the parallel N64 core, but there will be graphical issues.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the story that is sadly only average.
A bit of Turok 3's story is alluded to in the story for Turok 2. In Turok 2, you could access some warp portals and fight against the Flesh Eaters, and they talked about their boss, Oblivion. But you just shot the lot of them and then had a rock off against the Primogen, and you went home after saving the day. Guess what? Oblivion is still out there! And he is angry, and in a shocking move, Acclaim actually has Joshua Fireseed get killed in the opening cutscene of the game. This opening cutscene is pretty bloody well done for the year 2000, and on the cartridge-based N64 no less. Josh's death is an epic one, and he certainly goes out with a bang. Now, it is up to his siblings to head out and take on Oblivion. The game introduces the Council of the Big Giant Heads, and they're the ones who, along with Adon, gives the siblings their missions. The first level takes place in a fairly good-looking city that has some rather hilarious gatekeeping. If you go out of bounds, the cops have orders to shoot you on sight! And apparently Turok 3 takes place in the future, as they are equipped with flying cars. The boss for this level is a flying car that, well, does this. Did not see that coming. This is by far the easiest boss, and I was actually able to defeat it by just hitting it a bunch of times with an axe. The next mission takes place in a military base, and there are some tricky time segments where you have to turn off a self-destruct. The boss here is a mutated fish monster, and is the first of the puzzle bosses. Next, we make it to the Lost Land, and holy crap, look at the size of that bloody level. Remember, N64, cartridge-based system. They crushed this down to fit on a fucking ROM cartridge, and it looks like a very early Xbox game. The Lost Land level is quite good and turns me on. And we get another puzzle boss that required a walkthrough to figure out. Then we go back to the beginning and traverse some of Turok 1's first level, and it is glorious and really shows just how far gaming had come in just a few short years.
Now after we revisit the good old days, it's time to enter Hell.
We now enter a series of levels that are impressive as they are ball-crushingly hard. You know that classic AC/DC song called Ball Breaker? Yeah, this is what they were singing about. Expect to see this every couple of steps. The final levels start to get really bloody confusing to navigate, and I required a walkthrough to persevere. But at long last, you make it to the final boss.
What in Oblivion is that?
Oh, it is Oblivion! Wait, I thought it was made for a stay gun. Ah well, the rock-off with the devil can go easily if you take out 2 power stations in the previous level. As you can see, I never found that other bloody power station. Thus, this gives Oblivion a second health bar. There is a final boss fight right after this one, and it is nothing short of exceptional. I'm not going to show it here so that no one inadvertently spoils themselves, as it is definitely something that needs to be played. As to how there's 2 light buttons, well, calling all the way back to my first Turok review, just repeat to yourself, it's just a game, you should probably just relax. With Oblivion finally defeated, the universe is saved, and surprisingly enough, Joshua Fireseed actually stays dead at the end of the game. Now, he does come back to life for a few seconds, delivers some cryptic crap, and then goes back to being dead. That was a pretty risky prospect back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Main characters were actually considered important, unlike today, and so killing off the main character for the entire game series was something that no one would have really expected at this time, and thankfully it was handled quite well, and the 2 replacements for Joshua Fireseed complement each other quite well, and do honor to his memory. Turok 3, a game that is definitely well worth playing, but a game that is sadly not quite as good as its predecessor. Turok 2 did so many things right, and was such a standout game that following it is a very difficult prospect. Turok 3 does a good job following it, but does not surpass it in any way. Turok 3's weapons are very generic in comparison to Turok 2's. There is no new cerebral bore. There is no new Razorwind. It's just following on what came before. The levels, while definitely much more cinematic, feel less varied and have less identity. The story, while more advanced with more well-animated cutscenes and dialogue and things of that nature, just feels kind of disjointed and silly at times. With all that in mind, Turok 3 is still an excellent entry in the series, even if it's not as standout as the first 2 games.
This game is in a drastic need of remastering. This game, while not as standout as Turok 2, is still well worth playing, and if remastered, could garner a great deal of fandom around it, because it is still a solid title, and one that I cannot recommend enough. And so, I am GeneralLotz, wishing you good Turok, Rage Wars, and good GoldenEye 64, or whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you this awesome content.